Thank you very much. And at that point, we will conclude topical questions and we'll turn to First Minister's questions. First question, Jackson Carlo.
Presiding Officer, may I begin by congratulating everyone concerned in the remarkable achievement of constructing and making ready NHS Louisa Jordan, our armed forces, contractors and our dedicated NHS staff. As the First Minister has said, we hope its use proves to be unnecessary, but what a superb achievement, resource and reassurance to all of us it is. First Minister, constituents of mine have contacted me in some distress, wondering whether sometimes, with what sound like quite serious conditions unrelated to coronavirus, they should attend hospital. Does the First Minister agree with me that while we all work to save the NHS, people should not sacrifice their own health and must make continued use, when appropriate, of the NHS? And can the First Minister indicate what estimate the Scottish Government has made of the number of people who they may have anticipated making continued use of NHS facilities who have not? And emphasise again, on behalf of us all, that if people need medical assistance, they should not hesitate to seek it. First Minister.
Can I thank Jackson Carlo for that question, which I'll come to directly, but let me firstly echo his comments about the NHS Louisa Jordan. Everybody involved in that has been absolutely outstanding in their efforts, dedication and commitment. The help of the Army in the planning of it was invaluable, and I want to put on record my thanks to them. But all of the construction workers, the clinical staff, everybody involved in that has really performed a miracle, and I am deeply grateful to each and every one. We fervently hope we don't need to use the hospital, but I certainly know and I'm sure I speak for the Health Secretary as well, feel more assured knowing that that additional capacity is there. On Jackson Carlo's substantive point, I couldn't agree more. Clearly, we have had to take some very difficult decisions, including, of course, the postponement of non-urgent elective treatment on the health service in order to focus and orientate the health service on doing what it needs to do to deal with increased demand for COVID-19 cases. That is general hospital capacity, intensive care capacity, but also what we've done to create the assessment hubs to free up GPs for other things. That's really important, but it is vital that all of us get a message across that the NHS is open for other things. So anybody out there who is experiencing symptoms, perhaps finding a lump, unusual bleeding, particularly people who are worried about symptoms that their children might have from conditions that they are already aware of, or anything that they're worried about developing, contact the health service, the GP, out of hours, NHS 24 on the 111 number, and of course accident and emergency if that is needed. In terms of the figures, the Chief Medical Officer yesterday gave some of these figures in terms of reduction in people seeking urgent referral for cancer. This is something across a range of conditions we will be monitoring and making that information available as appropriate in order to encourage people to come forward. We want to get that message across. The NHS is there if you need it, so if you need it, don't hold back, come forward for the help that the NHS is there to give you.
Jackson Carlo.
Yeah, I thank the First Minister. That is an important message and I hope everyone hears it. First Minister, we've been discussing issues with PPE for some time now. A few weeks ago, the Scottish Government conceded that there were difficulties and it set up an email for any staff to get in touch with problems. Jean Freeman said then, those emails are monitored by ministers so that we can act on them straight away. Now, this weekend, an intensive care doctor in Glasgow said that 9 days after emailing, he still hadn't had a response. He said in the largest ICU in Scotland, there were no visors and staff were reusing single-issue visors, potentially contaminated with COVID-19. First Minister, does this sound like a process that is working?
First Minister.
Can I say that, yes, we have been talking about PPE issues since this pandemic started. I will predict we will continue to be talking about PPE issues for the duration of it, because by the very nature of this issue, staff are going to feel anxious. We will be anxious and constantly monitoring supplies and making sure that those supplies get to the front line where they needed. So this is not something on which we will ever say job done, such as the importance of making sure we are on it every single day. On the issue of the clinician at Greater Glasgow and Clyde, the Health Secretary answered this question at our daily update on Sunday. The issue had been dealt with, but unfortunately the clinician hadn't been replied to. We apologise for that, but these issues are dealt with as quickly as possible when they come in. We've undertaken to provide more information around the the data and the analytics around this email address, but there's more than 1,400 emails have been received into the mailbox, I think up until the 16th of April. There's a team of around 20 people working on that. The mailbox is monitored from 8 AM to 10 PM Monday to Friday, from 8 AM until 6 PM at the weekend. We've asked the Minister for Parliamentary Business to give particular ministerial oversight to that. So we will continue to respond to issues as they arise. More generally on PPE, we have sufficient stocks of things right now, but we are never complacent about that. We are always looking through NSS to see how we can replenish stocks as they are used. Obviously, demand depends on the usage, which in turn depends on admissions to hospital and the situation in care homes. I think for gowns and goggles would be the two items of PPE where, in terms of supplies, we have most ongoing concern right now, but steps are being taken to make sure that stocks are replenished. So this is something that will continue for as long as this pandemic lasts to be under active and ongoing consideration by ministers and by those who work with us.
Jackson Carlo.
Inevitably complex. And it doesn't help that specific numbers can seem hard to come by. The First Minister talked there about sufficient stock. Yesterday when asked, she said she didn't have the exact number of hospital gowns to hand. And last week, Jean Freeman said the same thing in response to my colleague Miles Briggs about supplies to care homes. Now, earlier today, we heard that 80 million PPE items have been delivered so far in total. But more detail would help us understand what this actually means for frontline staff. So can the First Minister confirm, of those already delivered, how many of the PPE items come from each of the procurement routes? How many PPE items have been ordered for the weeks ahead? Because I understand there are 3 procurement routes that they come from. And how many weeks of supply are now in place for hospitals, for GPs and for social care?
First Minister.
Before I come on to that, there was an aspect of Jackson Carlo's previous question that I meant to touch on, and that is to give an assurance to clinicians or those working in social care that no PPE item that is intended for single use should be reused, and that is an important part of the guidance that we give. We're not trying to avoid giving these numbers. I hope people will understand that any number I give right now for the number of aprons or gowns or gloves that we have available will be out of date almost as soon as I give it, because of the nature of this, that we are constantly supplying and updating stocks. We have the different supply routes, and we will use them as appropriately. We've obviously got different supply routes. We've also got different distribution routes to get these to the front line. So we, have for example, aprons right now, we've got 1 to 2 weeks on stock, but actions are being taken to make sure that that is replenished. Gloves, we've got 12 weeks of stock, for example. These are things that are under constant monitoring, but by definition, these figures are changing all the time as items are used and as stocks are replenished. So we give as much information as we can around these things, but the main assurance I would ask people to take is that this is something that principally National Services Scotland, which is our procurement agency, is on literally every minute of the day to make sure that we are able to give confidence about the supplies of these items of equipment, not just now, but into the future as well.
Jackson Carlo.
I think sometimes the confusion comes from understanding whether the available stock is there for each of hospitals, for GPs and for social care. And that on some occasions the answer may be relevant to hospitals but not to the other two, and then we get emails from people saying, well, we don't have X, Y, Z. So it's that complexity of trying to understand the supply that is available in each of those 3 chains. And of course PPE is not just for hospitals but for care at home and also residential care. The First Minister has mentioned that councils are responsible for the procurement of PPE for care homes, and at the weekend new funding for councils was announced by the Chancellor, which produced additional funding of £155 million for Scotland. The key question then is, how is that money going to be allocated? So to help not just on PPE but on the broad range of issues in which local government is leading the COVID-19 response, how will the Scottish Government decide to allocate the additional £155 million, and will the Scottish Government publish this week how much cash each council will receive?
First Minister.
I'll give an assurance, as I've given on other elements of consequential funding. Every penny that comes to us will be passed on for the purposes intended. So all of the money that comes to us for local authorities will go to support local authority services. We will have no doubt discussions with local authorities about exactly how that is used and allocated, and we'll update Parliament as soon as possible. To come back to the PPE here, and I think these things are, I know, complex for people, but we've got to be careful we think about supply and distribution differently. So NSS procures supplies, NSS supplies the National Health Service. It also provides top-up supplies to care homes, because care homes have their own supplies in place. But for example, at the moment, NSS is providing distribution to care home, direct to care homes, of top-up supplies to make sure that they've got what they need, prioritising those care homes that already have outbreaks. So we've taken steps to make sure that the distribution routes are as streamlined, efficient and effective as possible, and that we are always listening to feedback so that we can make further improvements around that. So it is important that we understand the differences there, but fundamentally the most important thing that matters to me and to the Health Secretary is that everybody has what they need when they need it, and we are taking the steps, not getting too sort of bothered at the moment about who is normally responsible for these things, but we're taking the steps we need to take to make sure that those supplies are there.
Thank you. Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by expressing our condolences to all those who have lost loved ones to COVID-19 over the last few days, and our support to all those care and NHS workers saving lives and going way beyond the call of duty. Which is why I had seriously hoped that the issue of personal protective equipment would be resolved by now. But when I hear regularly from council leaders and NHS and care workers alike that PPE is, to quote them, still a big issue, I need to raise it with the First Minister once again. The First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary insist that we have sufficient stocks of PPE, but that's no comfort to carers and to vulnerable people if supplies are still not reaching the front line. We know that many lives are being lost in our care homes, and many care homes are still facing a shortage of PPE. So I ask again, what is the First Minister's advice to those care workers who find themselves on shift in Scotland's care homes tonight without the PPE that they need?
First Minister.
Well, care home providers will not be fulfilling their responsibilities to staff who are in that position. To staff, we have put in place the email address that I have spoken about. We are doing everything we can to make sure there are ways in which staff, if they cannot resolve these issues through their employers or their managers, have ways of bringing these things directly to ministers, and we'll continue to do that. Can I say to Richard Leonard, and I say it genuinely here, if he ever hears me, if anybody ever hears me standing up in this chamber during this pandemic and saying we've resolved the issue of PPE, you should really have a go at me then, because that would demonstrate a level of complacency that I will never want to do in handling this. Because these are issues, we know there's a global pressure on supply, so NSS has to work literally round the clock every day to make sure it is sourcing and securing supplies. We have to make sure, and we have already made significant changes to distribution. So, for example, we had put in place 2 particular routes for care homes, the PPE triage helpline, and also deliveries of PPE to local hubs, so that could then be distributed onwards or collected by social care providers. In the last few days, we've put an additional distribution in place where NSS are delivering top-up supplies, a 1-week supply, to care homes directly. So we're trying as far as possible to take a belt and braces approach to this, while putting a safety net in place if any care home worker feels they don't have what they need, that they have somewhere to go. But let me add, I'm not trying to pass responsibility to anybody. This is a national endeavour that as First Minister I have a responsibility to make sure I am leading, but care home providers have a responsibility to their staff to make sure that they have these supplies, and I certainly hope and expect that all of them are doing that, and we will continue to discharge our responsibilities to make sure the supplies are there and they are distributed to where they need to be. But I will never ever stand up here and say that PPE is not an issue that we need to continue to look at on a day-to-day basis.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you, and thank you for that answer. I mean, the employer does have a duty of care, but we also have a duty of care to those workers as well. And it's one that we do need to take seriously, and we need to make sure that we understand that one worker without PPE is one worker too many without PPE when they need it. Let me turn to another issue, because we are also hearing concerning reports about the choices facing care home residents and their families as well. Yesterday I spoke to Margaret. Her husband is 70, he has Alzheimer's. Last autumn, he moved into residential care. Margaret's husband is still physically fit, which is why Margaret was so distressed last week to receive a call from a GP who, incidentally, has never personally treated him, recommending that she give consent for a do not attempt CPR notice and agree that he should not be admitted to hospital in the event he contracted COVID-19. Margaret doesn't want to sign such an order, yet has been told that ultimately the final decision on whether to administer treatment or send her husband to hospital will be the GP's and not Margaret's. Of course, every single patient needs clinical judgment on an individual level. But why, when the capacity on NHS wards and in intensive care units is there, are our care home residents being treated differently to other COVID-19 patients?
First Minister.
I've addressed this issue before, and I'm very happy and keen to do so again, and to do so very clearly. I've actually, I think this morning or possibly last night, just signed a letter to Richard Leonard on this very issue, so hopefully what I'm about to say to him today will be available in that form as well. Let me take first of all the issue about hospital admission. Any person, whether they are in a care home, in their own home or wherever, should be treated as an individual if they have COVID. And the decision that is made about the treatment they have and whether that treatment is delivered in their own home, which in the case of a care home resident is their care home, or in hospital, should be clinically driven. There should be no set, predetermined approach, and that is absolutely clear, and that is how GPs in the health service should be dealing with it. On the issue of DNR, do not resuscitate, Margaret, and I'd be very happy if you want to pass Margaret's detail too, so we can give her some reassurance directly. Margaret should not feel forced to sign such a document. Nobody should feel forced to sign such a document, and we've been very clear that those forms should not be issued in that kind of way without the sensitive and proper discussions that go around these things. We do, aside from COVID, we of course encourage GPs to have anticipatory care conversations with their patients. You know, all of us at some point have to think about what we would want at the end of our lives, but these should be sensitive discussions, they should be holistic discussions, and if it is appropriate and a patient or an individual wants it, a DNR discussion can be part of that. But nobody should be forced to contemplate signing one of these in isolation without of that. And we've been very clear about that, and will continue to be clear about that to GPs and to others as well.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. And my purpose in raising these cases is to try to bring to the First Minister's attention what people's experience out there is. And the Scottish Human Rights Commission raised concerns 2 weeks ago about the Scottish Government's clinical guidance. Age Scotland said, and I quote them, "People are pressurised into agreeing to no CPR." Just last week, I was contacted about a standardised letter sent by a Glasgow GP practice to relatives of care home residents, saying that there would be no transfers to hospital. The government has been content up until now to move vulnerable people out of hospitals and into care homes. So why is there still so much resistance to move vulnerable people out of care homes into hospitals when they need it? Everyone must have an equal right of access to treatment, and so to the chance of life itself. That is not only a founding principle of our National Health Service, It is a measure of our values as a society as well. So what will the First Minister do to make sure that that principle is applied and that those values are upheld, even in the face of this pandemic?
First Minister.
Well, let me repeat some of what I said before and do it as clearly and as emphatically as I can. Anybody who needs to be in hospital, where that is the clinical judgment made about their care and where they are best to be treated, should be in hospital. And that applies to care home residents just as it applies to anybody else. And any member, and I say this on this issue, I say it on PPE, I say it on any issue, if matters are being raised with you where things appear not to be happening in line with how they should be happening, bring those issues to us directly and quickly, and we will work to resolve them. Lots and lots of people contact me right now. I do my best. I can't reply to everybody's email personally, but I do my best to monitor what's coming into my email inbox so that I've got a sense of the issues that are causing people concern. So don't sit on these issues and wait for Parliament to be sitting in this session. Please get in touch. Everybody deserves person-centred individual care that is right for them, particularly with older people. And this would never be a judgment for somebody like me, it would be a clinical judgment in all cases. But particularly for older people, sometimes the clinical judgment will be that they are better to be cared for within their own home environment, whether that is their own home or the care home they are living in. But that should not be a predetermined thing, that should be based on what is best for that patient. So I am absolutely clear about that, I am emphatic about that, and any examples or instances where that is not happening, or there is an appearance that there is a situation being applied contrary to that, then we will take that forward, look into that and resolve that. Human rights, just finally, the human rights aspects of everything we are doing right now is absolutely core to all of our considerations. We are placing, if we go outside the health and care aspect of this for a moment, we are placing significant restrictions on people's freedom of movement, on the way people live their lives. So that human rights consideration to everything we do right now has to be central, and that will continue to be the case as we take decisions about the period that lies ahead.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On Friday, the First Minister said that recovery from this crisis must involve building a fairer, greener and more equal society. There is a growing recognition that business as usual wasn't working for most people. It was causing poverty and inequality, as well as environmental destruction. Economic recovery must surely mean that we finally stop undervaluing those people whose work we all depend on, the carers and cleaners, those working in food supply and public services, but also that we recognise it's unacceptable to leave so many people with precarious incomes and precarious housing. So can I ask the First Minister to commit to ensuring that as we take on the challenge of planning a recovery from this crisis, public support for businesses from the Scottish Government will be directed at those clean, green industries that can build a new, more healthy economy, and to rule out public funding for companies that are at odds with that goal, like high-carbon industries, those paying poverty wages, and businesses registered in tax havens?
First Minister.
Look, in general terms, I agree with Patrick Harvey. I think there will be lots of things as we come out of this crisis and the immediate part of this crisis that we all will want to think afresh. I mean, I know while it's still difficult, I feel at the moment to lift my eyes from what is immediately in front of us. I know I feel that, whether we're talking about the social care sector or how our economy is structured, things like universal basic income, these are all things that perhaps there was a reluctance to discuss before that now must be to the fore. So how we make sure, which of course we try to do anyway and have tried to do before this, the support that government can bring to bear is in line with the kind of society and economy that we're trying to build, is absolutely central to that. Of course, we can't ignore the here and now in terms of the hardship people are suffering, the jobs that are on the line in different parts of the economy and different parts of the country, given some of the sectors that are involved. And we have to help people work through the here and now, as well as making these bigger judgments and decisions about the future. So that's something that government has to be in the leadership position of, but that's a debate for all of us. And there are things in every single element of how we do things here that we would never have wished this situation to bring us to these points. But there's everything that we've done will have examples of how we've done things differently in a way that actually we would want to try and continue to do them. So these are big debates that I hope we get to engage with properly in the not too distant future. It's for all of us to do that. It's for us to all think long and hard and very carefully about it. But I'm sure Patrick Harvey will understand, from a government perspective, we still have to have a lot of our focus right now on the immediate things we need to do to get the country from here to a point where we have something like normality back. We will not have complete normality back for quite some time. We're going to have to live with this virus for some time to come, but doing that, continuing to suppress it with a semblance of normality, getting to that kind of balance is what is going to occupy much of our thinking, certainly for the next few weeks and probably beyond.
Patrick Harvey.
It is undeniably true that there are huge urgent issues that come before that question of longer term planning for recovery. And before we consider embarking on any kind of recovery, we need to be ready with the public health measures that will let us do it safely. And the case has been made very strongly that when the time comes, whether that's in the weeks or the months ahead, a strategy of test, trace and isolate is going to be what's needed. Now, the Scottish Government is now using that term regularly, and that's a welcome change. But the strategy isn't in place yet. Everybody should be pleased if the extra hospital capacity that's been built isn't all needed. That would be good news. But the same is not true of testing capacity. We've increased our capacity to test, but it only has value if we actually use it. So can the First Minister explain why around half of Scotland's COVID testing capacity is being unused at the moment, why we're still testing a much lower percentage of our population than most European countries, and when she believes a test, trace, isolate strategy will in fact be in place?
First Minister.
Undertaking the work to put that in place, and let me, before I come back to the detail and the specifics of that question, just say that as we start to lift some of the most stringent restrictions that are in place right now, and I don't know exactly when that will be, but as we start to do that, we should be under no illusion that we are still facing a period where we will have to be suppressing this virus and doing it in different ways. Now, continued social distancing is likely to be a part of that for a while, but test, trace and isolate will be a significant part of that as well. So in the work that we will need to do to build the capacity, that's not just about testing, that is about contact tracing and thinking about how we then support people who are having to isolate as a result of that. That work is underway. In terms of the testing approach right now, we are building the capacity. That capacity is on track for the target we set for the end of this month, but will require to continue to build beyond that. We are looking carefully right now at what is the situation where we are not yet using all of the capacity that we have. We set 3 objectives for testing at the outset of this. One, to test sick people in hospital. We're now expanding that to people in care homes. The second objective was key workers. We are now testing more key workers with every week that passes, and these drive-through centres at Glasgow Airport and others, these are over and above the numbers we report, which are from NHS lab capacity. We are still focused on getting more care sector workers through that, but the impact of that has started to be seen and is being seen in reducing absence rates in our health service, for example. And the third is around surveillance and making sure that we are using surveillance testing through our assessment hubs in particular as part of our overall surveillance of what this virus is doing. So we're looking right now at how we use that capacity we're building to the full now, but also that is important to go back to the point I started on, because that then becomes the bridge into the mass testing that will be required as part of the strategy for the future. So these things are all underway at pace, and with a huge amount of planning around them, and I look forward to keeping Parliament updated in the weeks ahead.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
I want to thank the First Minister and the Health Secretary for responding so positively to suggestions about care homes and testing for all new residents. I think those steps should help to give more confidence to care home residents and their families. Can I offer another suggestion? Since 2010, members of the UK military have been entitled to a daily operational allowance of £29 when they are deployed to specific operations in demanding conflicts. Would the First Minister consider such a proposal for frontline NHS and care staff to give an extra £29 a day reward for their service during this pandemic?
First Minister.
I will certainly consider any suggestions like that. I mean, we will absolutely, certainly want to make sure that in no doubt a variety of different ways we are recognising the contribution that health and care staff have made, but recognising and rewarding that. I want that to be in a way that makes sure that we have a system in Scotland, as I believe relative to other parts of the UK, we more so do have a system that properly rewards our NHS and care staff through the pay that we give them, but we will want to make sure that we reflect properly on this experience and, you know, to go back to something Patrick Harvey said, make sure that we, and this applies broader than just this issue, that what we are learning through this crisis about what really matters in life and what we really value most is actually reflected in where we spend our money as a government as well. On the issue about care home testing, if I can just very briefly, we have listened here, we're trying to build as much assurance there as possible, so we said we'll test all symptomatic residents in care homes, and the Health Secretary today has talked about admissions into care homes. One of the points we've made, though, in terms of the first of those, that doesn't change the clinical management of people, and it's really important to stress that. But particularly with people going into care homes where they're not symptomatic, we know the test is not reliable when people don't have symptoms. So it's really important that we don't allow it to offer false assurance. The infection control and the isolation and everything remains the most important thing we do there.
Willie Rennie.
No, I recognise absolutely that last point. We need to make sure everything is in place to protect individuals in care homes, including those who are coming in. So the strictest of measures is absolutely essential. A survey conducted by the charity Inclusion Scotland has identified worrying evidence, at times horrific, from parents of children with additional support needs. We find that their children are exhibiting behaviours such as self-harm because of the removal of their structure of their daily routine, contact with friends and access to the outdoors. For some, the only form of exercise they could take was swimming, and that has gone as well. Will the First Minister look at what more can be done to support these families? And can they be given special consideration as we do consider the strategy for the exit from the lockdown?
First Minister.
Consider on an ongoing basis what more we can do to support people in the situations that Willie Rennie has described, and vulnerable people generally, though obviously vulnerable people have different vulnerabilities and can't be treated as one homogenous group, and that will definitely be to the fore of our thinking as we look towards the next phase. I've said in public before, I'll say it in Parliament now, we will later this week publish not a hard and fast exit strategy from the lockdown, but some of the principles that will guide us in the framework in which we will take these decisions to begin that process of opening up that discussion to the wider public. On the issue about young people with additional needs, I mean, there are many aspects of what we're doing to deal with this virus that worry me as much as the virus itself in some respects, and that is one aspect of this. There is one important point of detail that I think Willie Rennie had actually raised previously about the guidance around exercise for example, people with autism to be allowed to exercise more than once a day to help them stick to their routines. And we have decided to amend that guidance to give greater clarity about these things being permissible, to try to help as far as possible in these exceptional, unusual circumstances to help people have as much structure to their day as possible. We will continue to give full consideration to all of these issues.
Thank you. Just to let members know, there are 18 members currently wishing to ask a question. I don't think we can possibly get through all that many, but we'll make a start. Liz Smith, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Liz Smith.
Thank you. I wonder, could I ask the First Minister what advice the Scottish Government could give to two of my constituents in Milnathort who had successfully been producing head shields for their local GP practice and were then offered to do the same for NHS Glasgow, NHS Tayside and NHS Fife, but their financial advisor said that they would not get any liability insurance, and therefore they've decided to stop their production. What advice can you provide?
First Minister.
If you can please pass us with the details, I will undertake to look into that to see if we can do anything to resolve that, because where it is obviously with PPE we always need to make sure there's a quality assurance process, and that what is being produced is safe and reliable for people to use it, but where people want to help and can contribute, we want to encourage them to do that. So if Liz Smith can pass the details to my office or the Cabinet Secretary's office, we will see what we can do to resolve the matter.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will no doubt agree that our entrepreneurs, who often risk all to start their own businesses, will be essential to restoring the Scottish economy following lockdown. Given that many thousands of self-employed people continue to fall through the gaps in the Chancellor's safety net, what more can and should be done to assist self-employed people and our innovative new companies?
First Minister.
The Economy Secretary, of course, has given some more detail today of the additional £100 million we announced last week and how that will help, amongst others, newly self-employed people who previously would not have been eligible for UK Government or Scottish Government schemes. So we want to continue to find different ways, innovative ways where we can of plugging these gaps. You know, it stands to reason we have financial constraints that perhaps limit what we can do in totality, but I hope we've shown willing to try to be flexible, to listen to suggestions and to help as many people in businesses and as many different categories as possible. So the Economy Secretary and the Finance Secretary will continue to be open to suggestions and to dialogue on these matters.
Anas Sarwar, to be followed by Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking the First Minister and her team for the unenviable task they are doing on behalf of the country. I know that it's a hard enough job at any normal time, but at this particular time when we're trying to save lives in Scotland, it is a particularly difficult time. So a genuine thank you to you and all your team. The Cabinet Secretary for Health said in mid-March that within a few days there would be no gaps in terms of adequate PPE on the front line in our primary care service. Today the Cabinet Secretary said that we continue to have sufficient supplies, but despite that, the BMA survey published today says that only 22% of doctors on the front line believe they are fully protected. We have had 1,600 emails to the PPE account. That's about 80 a day, saying they do not have access to adequate levels of PPE. Can I ask the First Minister, we recognise this is a global pandemic. We recognise there is global demand for PPE. Perhaps we should just be straight with the public to say we are doing the best we can to get all the PPE we can, and we need to do the best we can with what we have. And that would be a much better approach in terms of building that connection and relationship with those on the front line who are having to do this unthankful task, rather than saying we have the PPE, but people then facing those challenges. Let's be straight with the public, and we can get through this together.
First Minister.
Can I thank Anas Sarwar for his comments and also for the sentiment and the spirit in that. And I've tried from the outset of this, as has the Health Secretary, to be straight and frank with people, and will continue to do that. These are not easy challenges. But on PPE, the supplies that we have and the supplies that we are seeking to procure, although there are challenges in that, and I'll never shy away from them, are intended to make sure that we can give frontline staff what they need in terms of the guidance that has been provided. I don't want us, if we can at all avoid it, to get into a situation where we are directing use of PPE that is driven by supplies as opposed to what is needed to protect staff. I cannot give an absolute guarantee we'll never run into supply difficulties given the global constraints, but we will work really hard to avoid that. And I am not making any criticisms of any other government, but we didn't at this stage require to change our guidance at the end of last week in the way that NHS England had to do, because they had some supply issues. I'm not saying we will never be in positions like that ourselves, but we want to work here as hard as we can to get the supplies that we need, and we're sourcing supplies from all sorts of places right now to make sure that health and care staff do feel that they've got what they need, and that will continue to be our focus and priority. That said, I recognise that this is a time of high anxiety for people working in these jobs, and just for me to say you've got what you need and it's the right kind of PPE and there's plenty of supplies is not necessarily going to take that anxiety away from people. This is a really stressful situation. I keep saying this, but you know, it's true of all of us. You know, I know that from my own relatives who work in the health service. You know, they are very, very stressed and anxious about this right now. And that is understandable, but it just redoubles the need for us to do everything we can to make sure that they've got the supplies that we need, and be frank along the way about the challenges all of us are facing in that.
Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have received communications from constituencies who have applied for business grants. however, have only received so far an acknowledgement. Can the First Minister confirm what numbers of qualifying businesses have received their grants to date versus the number of applications which have actually been received?
First Minister.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's overall about 28,000, but correct me if I'm wrong in terms of that. This varies right now across different local authorities, and we are encouraging and supporting local authorities to deal with these applications as quickly as possible. Certainly the last figure I saw, we local authorities had already paid out grants worth about, in fact I've got the figure here right now, 220, sorry that was 120 million to of this 200 million, I think, of this. My apologies for reading these figures wrongly. So this is an ongoing process, and we want local authorities to get this money out of the door and into the pockets of businesses as quickly as possible, and we will continue to do that. I've now found the right figures in my brief. Everybody will be glad to know. 18,528 grants have been awarded, valued at 215 million of that, but that will be a moving process as we go through the next. That was last week, the Cabinet Secretary is telling me, so there'll be more than that right now. But the principle is the right one. We want to get this money out as quickly as possible.
Bill Kidd, to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister, how many charities are receiving financial support from the Scottish Government?
First Minister.
We set up a particular fund, as Bill Kidd will be aware, for the third sector and for charities. So 7 million has already been committed to provide around 2,000 charities with a small grant of £2,000. A further £10 million has been allocated for some national priorities with recent awards to, for example, Scottish Women's Aid and Age Scotland. There's another £33 million which is open to expressions of interest as of the 13th of April. On Monday, more than 1,600 third sector organisations were invited to complete an application for grants between £5,000 and £100,000, and applications are currently being assessed. We absolutely recognise the important work that third sector organisations do all of the time, but are doing right now, which is why it's important that we give them as much support as possible.
Claire Baker, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to raise the issue of the Census 2021 in light of the reported pre-action letter from the Sikh Federation to the Scottish Government and the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown. Is the First Minister able to provide assurances that the census is on track?
First Minister.
The census is currently on track, but obviously, as with everything else right now, we continue to have to assess and monitor that against the realities of what we are dealing with. But any changes to that, of course, would be communicated and reported to Parliament in the appropriate way, and Fiona Hislop, of course, oversees that and will undertake to make sure that that is done. But as of now, the census is on track.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister to clarify a specific issue for the oil and gas industry? Now, UK government guidance outlines how to socially distance on an offshore structure and states if you can't keep 2 metres away, you can take other action to keep safe while still operating. The Scottish Government's guidance doesn't seem to have that exemption. And my understanding is that that left companies confused and potentially exposed. So will the Scottish Government adopt a similar exemption in its guidance to companies so that a vital industry already in the toughest of times can keep operating?
First Minister.
Look, I will undertake to look into anything that's raised here, but we have, and we've talked about this in the Chamber before, we have issued guidance in Scotland for companies that look at the companies that I've described before as being in that space between the ones that are told categorically to close and the businesses that are essential to keep the country going, and the guidance there around whether businesses are doing something essential to the country's material well-being. If so, can they allow people to work from home? If not, can they safely social distance with the 2 metres? And if not, then our advice, very clearly based on health considerations, has been that these businesses should close. That is about prioritising public health, which in the longer term is in the interest of the economy as well. And I would ask businesses across Scotland to make sure that they pay heed to the advice and guidance that the Scottish Government gives. We will keep all of this under review, and as we go into the next phase of decision making around that, then obviously part of that will be to look carefully at what sectors of the economy, what businesses can at the right time be allowed to reopen as long as they can do so safely.
Gillian Martin, to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, the UK Chancellor announced £10 million in cash grants to support the fishing industry in England. Fishing is the lifeblood of many coastal communities across Scotland, as the First Minister knows, and it's a sector that's been really quite badly hit by this crisis. Can I ask the First Minister what support that her government has provided in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, we know that this virus and the implications of dealing with the virus has had a really immediate impact on some parts of the seafood sector, with almost in some cases the complete collapse of markets, which is threatening businesses and livelihoods. So we've been working hard. Fergus Ewing has been leading this work to make sure there's a package of support in place for seafood, fishing and aquaculture. So the package of support we now have in place is worth nearly £23 million. Over £3.5 million of that has already been paid out to the sector, and total more than 1,000 businesses, mainly in coastal and island communities, will now be eligible for support. So I think that's the right approach, and I would certainly one of the things I would urge the UK government to look more at is whether it can do more for fishing as well, and for the seafood sector more generally.
And Colin Smith to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister said she will not hesitate to take a different approach or a different timescale to the rest of the UK when it comes to exiting lockdown. The National Clinical Director said Orkney is different from Oxford Street. But does the First Minister agree that when it comes to the current path of COVID-19, there is little difference between Cumbria and Dumfries and Galloway, or the borders and Northumberland? So we need the right exit strategy for both sides of the border. And does she accept that two different strategies with two different timescales for communities right next to each other will simply add to confusion, and in fact will be almost impossible to enforce in one community when it's completely different in a neighbouring community, barely at a social distance apart?
First Minister.
These are all factors that we will have to and will take into account. I mean, I've been, I hope, pretty clear in what I've said about this, and let me be clear again. For me, on this issue, this is not some predetermined position, it's not some ideological position, it's not constitutional, it's not political. It is entirely driven by the best judgments we and the government, I and the government can make about what is right to protect the people we serve. This virus, like all viruses, but it doesn't respect borders or boundaries. People move, of course, across different parts of the UK. That will be particularly acute in the border communities that the member refers to. It's also the case that for simplicity of messaging, the more uniformity and consistency there is, then the easier it is to get messages across. But I will be driven in this by what the advice, with my own judgment applied to that, tells me is the right thing to do to protect people in Scotland. We've just spoken about an issue on advice to businesses, where we've taken a slightly different approach, because I thought the government thought that was necessary to give proper priority to the public health message. So where we think it's right, we will operate on a consistent UK-wide basis, but where we think it is right for Scotland to do something slightly differently, we will do that as well, and it will be driven entirely by what we think is best to meet the objectives that we're all working to right now: suppressing this virus, protecting the National Health Service and saving lives.
And Graham Simpson.
We've had a commitment already from the Scottish Government to set up a loan fund for private landlords if they suffer from lack of rental income. But can I ask about the social housing sector? Because that's being affected already. They've got a large number of tenants who pay by cash, pay their rent by cash, and obviously physically can't do that at the moment. There's also the strong possibility that tenants may just not be able to afford to pay rent however they pay. So can I ask for a commitment from the First Minister to also financially support housing associations through this crisis, so that they and their tenants are not left worse off at the end of this?
First Minister.
Well, I'm not going to give categoric commitments to specific assurances of financial support before we've properly talked through with different stakeholders and thought through the consequences and implications of that. But what I will do is give an assurance, whether it's to housing associations. I know from my own constituency the importance and value of housing associations. So whether it's housing associations and the social housing sector generally, or any other sector, we will have a dialogue, we will listen, we will try to respond as flexibly and as quickly as possible. This virus and what we're doing to deal with this virus will literally is already, but will continue to impact literally on every aspect of life. We are asking people to do extraordinary, unprecedented things, and that means that the response of the government has to be equally extraordinary and unprecedented. I think it is already. I think the same is true in terms of intervention from the UK government, but we always have to be looking, listening and considering what we can do more, and we will always do that.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid on that note, we're going to have to draw matters to a close. I'm conscious that there are many members who didn't get a chance to make a contribution and ask questions today. I would just draw their attention to the fact that we're going to have 2 virtual question time sessions later in the week on education on Thursday and on environment and rural affairs on Friday. However, moving on to the next item of business, it's consideration of Business Motion 21505 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a business programme. And could I call on Liz Smith to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much.